This is event obviously part of the Iran project of the Center for Global Communication Studies. Hamid is as most of you already know, is a professor of radio, television, and film, communication, and also art history at Northwestern University. And he's the leading authority on Iranian film, as well as diasporic, exilic, and post-colonial cinema and media. He's published many now classic books in English and Persian, including an accented cinema, exilic and diasporic filmmaking, and the making of exile cultures, Iranian television in Los Angeles, and on and on and on. I won't mention all the other books. His latest work is the magisterial 4-volume Social History of Iranian Cinema, which he'll be talking about today. It stretches from the artisanal cinema industry sponsored by the ruling Shahs in the early 1900s to the politics and genres of the latest new media production. The book so far has just recently won 2 awards. It's won the Best Book Award of the Middle East Studies Association of North America, and honorable mention in the Society for Cinema and Media Studies Catherine Singer Kovacs Book Award. I also just want to remind you that someone from the bookstore is outside, and Hamid will be available to sign books if you want to buy them, or if you brought your own right afterwards. I'm hoping he'll sign my Kindle edition. So thanks, Hamid, for coming.
Thank you very much, Peter, for inviting me, and also for your kind introduction. It's been about 15 years since I was here last, so I look much older, and some of the people that I've met then and I meet now are also somewhat older, but that's the way the world works. In the age of 140-letter Twitter texts, it seems foolish to write a book that was 3,000 pages long, and even stupid. And I guess that characterizes this effort. But it was a privilege, actually, to do this book, and it began more or less with the Iranian Revolution in 1978, and which really drove the Shah out of the country, turned him into an exile who couldn't find a home, going from one place to another in search of a home, until he came to the U.S. for treatment of his cancer, which he had kept secret until that time, and then caused the Iranians to take the American embassy hostage for fear that the Shah was in the U.S. for another redo of the 1953 coup d'etat that returned the Shah to power. And so that became sort of the touchstone for the representation of Iran and Iranians in the media. Up to that point, the U.S. media had represented Iran as a modern progressive country run by a young progressive Shah. And Jimmy Carter in 1977 at Christmas, when he went to Iran, he toasted the Shah for having presided over an island of stability in a sea of tumult in the Middle East. But within a year, the Shah was gone. So this revolution really set into motion for a lot of us, Iranians and others, a kind of epistemophilia, desire to know the causes of the revolution and the consequences of it, and how it happened, the way it happened. A revolution that we celebrated at first as a kind of a liberation from dictatorial power, but very soon turned out to be too early a celebration. And any opposition to the new regime was very much attacked very badly. I won't go into that now. Anyway, writing a book on social history of Iranian cinema was really a way that I began to deal with the Iranian Revolution and also with the larger issue of Iranian history. And I began with the question of the American representation of Iranian media, which was at first very unsympathetic to the revolution and hostile to it. presenting the Shah as a modernized and a modern individual. This resulted in a 5-year search into archives, which resulted in a filmography that I discovered incredible amount of documentaries that were made about Iran since 1900. Over 3,500 titles of documentaries that had been made in the West about Iran, plus 50 years of nightly newscasts by American and British television newscasts. And anybody who's studying contemporary Iranian history, I think, would benefit looking at this thing, because it's really surprising how much what the coverage is. At the same time that I was sort of focusing on the representation of Iran in the foreign media, I began to develop a kind of another optic towards Iran, to try and find out what the Iranian media itself was doing. And so I organized what became a controversial but also very successful film festival at UCLA, which is continuing. It has continued ever since, and it's now one of the largest film festival of Iranian cinema in its 23rd year or so. Many Iranian exiles who were the actors and directors and so forth came to call for the boycott of the film festival, because they thought that the festival would whitewash the Islamic Republic's crimes and so forth. And on radio, on television, and in newspapers in LA, they all clamored day in and day out about that, accusing the UCLA and myself for having become the cultural militia of the Islamic Republic, and so forth. And I had invited Dariush Merjoui and Abbas Kiarostami as guests of the festival, and they came, and Kiarostami walked to one of the directors standing in the picket line, and Parviz Sayad, and said to him, why don't you give me your placard? I'll stand in the line holding the placard, and you go inside and look at the films. See if you still agree with the boycott. Many of them did not. Some of them did go back eventually, and they changed their mind. But anyway, it was very important for me to have access to the Iranian point of view from the Iranian side, and not have it be represented either by the American media or by the exile media, both of which had their own axes to grind. Soon I moved to Rice University in Texas, and so this is the second film festival that I started there with the help of Miriam Luntz at the Museum of Fine Arts, and this festival still continues as well. And I'm giving you all of the detail because these are the kinds of impetuses and movements that eventually resulted in the book that I'm going to talk to you about. The first book that I did, and which was the result of my dissertation at UCLA, was this book on the making of Iranian exile culture, which for the first time really took seriously the pop culture that Iranians were producing. The music videos, the musical concerts, the radio, television shows, newspapers, magazines, the totality of the sort of the culture industry of the diaspora in LA. Before Los Angeles had become known as Irangeles or Tehrangeles and so forth. It was in its infancy, and I tried to tease out the dynamics of the media, because many Iranian minorities were now in LA. Lots of Iranian Jews and Baha'is and Armenians, all the people who had been minorities in Iran, involved in the music and film industry, and they knew how to be a minority. On the other hand, the Muslim majority in Iran, who now in exile were a minority, because the ethnic Iranian minority was now majority amongst the Iranians in exile. The Muslims didn't know how to be a minority. They didn't know how to organize associations, self-help associations, and those kinds of things. While the Jews and the Baha'is and Armenians, having experienced minoritarian situations in Iran, they reorganized themselves in California and using the same institutions as before, plus the fact that they could also tap into the existing Armenian, Jewish, Baha'i American institutions. And so the politics of Iranian exile media was really undergirded by interethnicity in a very fascinating way. For example, the Jews put up the money for the music industry. The Iranians sang with the groups. The Armenians were the players. And, you know, it was a very interesting dynamics that was going on. It was not all homogeneous. And this is the same thing that I will argue was happening in Iran in the film industry, namely the role of ethno-religious minorities being very important. And anyway, exile is really a particularly anxious space in which one simultaneously benefits from surplus and overlap while deep down suffering from feelings of lack and inadequacy. The state of being more than is always haunted by that of being less than or not quite. And my long engagement with this situation of exile then resulted in several, not only this book, but also this book on the whole idea of home, exile, and homeland, and the accented cinema, which theorize a kind of a global cinema of diaspora. And finally, I should mention one work that I did in Persian, a 2-volume book on a documentary film that came out at the time of the revolution and became a standard textbook in Iran, and it went out of publication very soon. So, while I was working on the 4-volume book on Iranian cinema, I was doing these other books. So it's not as though I was not doing anything, playing somewhere. This 4-volume book, Social History of Iranian Cinema, has been in the making for over 30 years. It's older than my 2 kids, my own biological children. It is sort of a third child, in a way. And so now onto the book. The book really focuses on both social and political change and on film industry change. And the argument of it is that both the politics of Iran during the 20th century was moving towards authoritarian modernization, state-driven authoritarian modernization, and the film industry was also an agent of modernity. In terms of socio-political change, for those of you who need a little quick brush up, Iranian social history in the 20th century really is bookended by 2 revolutions, one in 1905, 1911, which replaced the absolute monarchy of the Qajar dynasty with a parliamentary monarchy. The Qajar dynasty was finally dissolved in 1925 by the last Shah's father, who himself was driven into exile in 1941 when the Allied invaded Iran, and they pushed him into South Africa, where he died. His son came to power, a young son, in 1941, and he ruled until 1979 by the Islamic, what is later on called Islamic Revolution. In many ways, the revolution was not Islamic originally, but it became that way for various reasons. Now, in terms of the argument about cinema's role in bringing modernity into Iranians, it did this in several ways. One, and I will show you some examples for this. One is that film brought modernity by displaying sites of modernity and processes and products of modernity. it embodied mobility and speed. I'm sure you've all heard the story of the early audiences running away from the cinemas when in the 1890s. Early films showed a train coming into the station. The audiences thought that the train was coming right at them into the audience, and they ran away. When I interviewed Muhammad Ali Jamalzadeh, the famous writer who at age 12 remembers watching a film in Tehran, he recited that same story. Of course, this story has become such a kind of a meme in Iran in film studies, and maybe it is perhaps even apocryphal, we don't know. But the idea that film really, especially later on, assaultive angle or assaultive movements of the objects in the film, or assaultive framing and zooming and so forth, all of these had certain repercussions in the audience. And speed also was brought home to Iranians by travel. Nasruddin Shah, for example, who traveled to Europe, I was reading his diaries. He was complaining of how fast the trains were going. He was saying, this train is going so fast that I'm getting vertigo. Or when he was housed in a hotel in London, he complained about the amount of noise that is there in the streets. When do these God-forsaken people sleep? Why don't they shut up? Why is there so much noise of horse-drawn cars and so forth after dark and so forth? So noise and speed and mobility and movement, all of these are characteristics of modernity that cinema also embodied. Cinema embodied the industrialization of movies. Really was one of the ways that cinema embodies modernity as well. In the US, for example, the studio system in the 1920s or so, in many ways borrowed from the dominant mode of production in the US, which was car manufacturing, in particular Ford Motor Company's division of labor, specialization of labor, that allowed Ford to produce 1 car an hour. So mass production was the result. Also, variation of models and so forth was another result in order to satisfy different tastes and so forth. And the same things were applied to the studio system. Studio system became divided. The art department, the camera department, sound department, costumes, and so forth. Each of them with heads and subheads and assistants and so forth. All of them with their own specialization. And this kind of division of labor and specialization allowed the American studio system to produce such a large number of films. Of course, it doesn't produce it's not the largest producer of film in the world, right? Which country is it? India. And recently, Nigeria, through their video films. So in Iran, the mode of production of cinema early on was also, like the U.S., influenced by the dominant mode of production in the country, which was the workshop phenomenon, the craft workshop phenomenon, where a master craftsman ran the workshop, knew everything, and had a number of apprentices whom he would teach, and of course he would make sure not to teach everything that he knew to the apprentices so that he would not be obsolete soon. And the same concept, I think, was applied to early Iranian films, which means that the early filmmakers were basically jack of all trades. They did everything. And I have all kinds of interesting stories about how they adapted a sewing machine, for example, to make a projector, and various other funny stories and ingenious local inventions to make things work. And of course, Iranian cinema, as I will show later on today, became really industrialized in the second Pahlavi period, so that by 1974, Iran was producing some 92 features a year, which is quite a large number, larger than most of the neighboring countries, and lots of different genres of films. And finally, cinema encourages modernity by the kind of individual subjectivity that it addresses. Both the continuity, editing, and filming of film allows each spectator to feel as though he or she is being individually addressed, so that they can identify with the characters on the screen and empathize with them and so forth. So these are some of the arguments that run through the four volumes at each turn. The volumes are divided into four. As you can see, the artisanal era focuses basically from 1894 to 1941. The reason I chose 1897 is because that's the first time that we have a published record of the first Iranian film exhibitor watching films in London. He writes in his diary, Ibrahim Khana Sahafbashi Tehrani in 1897 goes to Palace Theatre in London, and he sees a certain number of newsreel films, and he describes in his diary, which is published, what he saw. And so I put that date as the first date for the start of cinema in Iran, because I think it's very important not to focus only on production, but also spectatorship is an important aspect of cinema culture, which has, I think, been not seriously attended to in film studies. The industrializing years is associated with the period of the second Pahlavi, which I mentioned, and then the third volume deals with the Islamicate period, with the 4 or 5 year period when the culture changes from everything changes from Islamic Republic, from Pahlavi to Islamic Republic, and it's so iconoclastic, both the destruction and the reconstruction, that it really deserves to have its own volume. And then the fourth volume focuses on the cinema that emerged after the consolidation of the Islamic Republic and the film industry, focusing on a large chapter on women's cinema, a large chapter on documentaries, a large chapter on art house cinema, mainly the films that we see abroad as Iranian cinema, a chapter on public diplomacy and the contestation of media images between Iran and the rest of the world, the roles of foreign governments, Iranian exiles, Iranian governments, and so forth in creating in a kind of a media diplomacy. That's, I think, very fascinating. And I gave a talk about that at Berlin in that early conference. And then lastly, a large chapter on the Iranian exiles. The latest reports show that somewhere around 150 to 170,000 educated Iranians are leaving the country every year. And so the brain drain in Iran is just incredible. But that means that the Iranian exiles are very productive in various fields, and in the field of cinema. By my count, at least 1,500 films. They have made at least 1,500 films since the revolution in various countries and in various types of films. So I'm going to go to Volume 1. Now, Iranian contact, one of the things that I used a lot of historical materials, a lot of history, a lot of diaries, published or unpublished, about the contact of Iran with the West and the implication of that. It was really very traumatic. The contact of Iranians with modernity and with the West. because they did two kinds of comparison. One was a kind of lateral comparison, synchronic comparison, whereby they compared themselves with contemporary Europe, and they found themselves wanting, the Iranians. The other was historical, a diachronic comparison. They compared themselves today with their ancient Iran from the past, and again, they found themselves wanting. What happened to the glorious civilization and the empire that we had, and what befell us? Why are we so far behind, and so forth? Full of the diaries of early Iranian travelers abroad is full of these kinds of lamentations and comparison. I'll just give you one, which happens to be from Ibrahim Khan Sahaf Bashir Tehrani, that first exhibitor who goes to London to see film. On that same trip, he goes to Canada and then to the US, and he writes this because he goes to church. He says, "Today was the Sabbath for these people, and I went to their church. When I thought well, I realized that everything they have, we have its opposite." This is the comparative structure. For example, they have electric lights in their place of worship, and we have oil lamps. Their metal instruments are always clean and shiny. Ours are dirty and rusted. They quietly listen in their churches while we talk and shout in ours. Their preachers talk in a language everyone can understand. Ours talk in such a dense Arabic language that they themselves cannot understand it. They pass the donation plate quietly, and people drop money in it for a certain cause without anyone making a special appeal. We insist on donations for our own personal play and pleasure. They sit on velvet-covered benches. We sleep on dusty wicker mats. They attract people to the church with beautiful and varied songs. We sing only with reluctance. The differences are enormous. The only thing that we do better is washing our anus with water instead of with toilet paper. So that's the kind of lamentation they had. I locate the film industry and the mode of production, the narratives, aesthetics, and generic forms in the interplay of deeply rooted Iranian performative and visual arts, which means classical Persian music, miniature paintings, oral traditions such as naqali, taziyeh, passion plays, and performances, and in what was imported, adopted, adapted, translated, mistranslated, and hybridized from the West. Likewise, borrowing from the curtain reciting tradition. Curtain reciting tradition was a tradition of religious and popular tradition where a large curtain that was painted would be hung somewhere, and sometimes inside, sometimes outdoors, in cemeteries in particular. These curtains would basically contain paintings of either stories from Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, the Iranian epic, or the religious stories, the martyrdom of Imam Hussein and so forth. And a curtain reciter with a stick in his hand would point to various figures and tell the story, and also begin to perform some of the characters and the voices, and was very dramatic and very much like commercial television. Every so often he would stop and pass the donation plate around to get some money before he continued with his story. And it would sometimes take an hour or so for him to do all of this. I remember as a kid watching some of this. This figure, came into cinema, in the silent cinema. And I'll show you a picture and talk about that. And also, I want to say that, as I mentioned, Iranian ethno-religious minorities had a major part in Iranian cinema. This volume focuses on basically the artisanal cinema. The multifunctionality of the workshop production, the trauma with the West that I mentioned, the film narratives. The one thing that I haven't mentioned, and I probably won't go into it very much, is the idea that encountering the West on the screen was very traumatic for those who didn't go to the West. Those who went to the West wrote about their trauma in their diaries and so forth. Those who didn't go to the West, I think, nevertheless, were also traumatized by the sight of the West, partly because of all the stuff that the others felt who traveled, but also partly because of the properties of film. When you have Jamalzadeh, for example, the 92-some-year-old, he is now dead, but then when I interviewed him, he was 90-some years old, and he said when he saw film at the age of 12, he saw a steamroller roll over a person and make him completely flat, and in the next shot, the guy was standing up. Now, how could that be? If it was made flat, then he shouldn't be standing up. So that kind of trauma, the kind of visual trauma, or epistemic trauma was also an important part of watching film. And I have a whole chapter in which I talk about the epistemic violence of contact with the West. Iran was not colonized the way some other countries were. So Iran was not subject to military power and so forth, but Iran was subjected to a kind of epistemic violence through neocolonialism, which was, in some ways, if not much better, because it psychically damaged the people, I believe. And I sort of theorized this in the case of cinema. Qajar era cinema was another theory, another sort of theme of the book is that Iranian cinema was from the start kind of transnational, and because it began that way. Muzaffareddin Shah Qajar in 1900 traveled to France to go to Contrexeville, the mineral waters, because he was suffering from all kinds of illnesses and so forth. But it just so happened that 1900, the Universal Exposition in Paris was taking place. These Universal Expositions were very big affairs in which the big Western colonizing countries were basically showing their prowess, industrial and technological and innovative prowess. And colonial countries were displaying their way of life, their arts, their crafts, and in some cases, whole villages were brought actually to live in the premises, and in some cases they gave birth and children died and so forth over the 6 months or so that the expositions were going on. The Paris Exposition was significant for cinema because for the first time cinema was a big part of this. Cinema had been shown for about 4 or 5 years all around, but it was showcased in a big way here in the Paris Exposition. A curtain rose attached to a wench, rose from the floor, from inside the floor, and drawn up to the ceiling 90 feet high, and the audience was sitting in a circular amphitheater, so they had to see both from the screen from both sides. In order to expedite that, they actually sprayed water on the screen to make it translucent. So it was a big affair, and on this screen, the Shah saw films for the first time, and he also describes in his diary what he saw, and he said, we were so impressed by this that we ordered Akkosbashi, the official photographer who was with him, to buy the equipment and the films so that we could show to our servants, as he called them. On the way to Iran, they passed through Ostend, Belgium, and there the Shah also describes in his book that today I was outside and in the street, and a whole parade of women on carriages passed me by, throwing flowers at me, which I joyfully returned to them. And Akkosbashi was taking films of them. So this is the first reference that we have of somebody actually filming, and we didn't know that this was actually something that he was just saying or imagining, or because no film of it existed until 1982 when Shahriar Adl, another researcher who was researching early photography in the Golestan Palace, he found in a chest a whole bunch of film reels that were deteriorating and turning to dust, and lo and behold, that film is there, and I'm going to show you that. So this is the photographer, the official photographer, and this is the film that he took that has been restored Whoops, sorry, I'm going ahead of myself. Did it the wrong way. Okay, here we go. This is a silent film, of course. And it shows Muzaffaruddin Shah in his carriage. Every time you see him, he is directly staring at the camera. Here he is again. As though magically attracted. Soon we'll see some of the sites of the exposition in Paris with the River Seine in the foreground. Each nation had its own exhibition site. Iran had one. This is it. This is not Iran necessarily, but this is the exposition, the Universal Exposition site. This is one of the, what in film studies is called actualities, like news, basically the early news films, a series of clips of various events strung together. And here's the flower parade thing. The women on carriage throwing flowers at him and he is returning them. There you go. Of course, everything is long shot, so you can't. So unlike cinema in the West, which began as a popular medium, average people went to the movies. A lot of immigrants in this country, for example, were the first the spectators. In Iran, cinema began as an elite phenomenon, as part of the court system. And so in many ways, while it was within that enclosed system, it was protected and shielded from the politics and that eventually would affect it. And it also reflected some of the taste of the court for the kinds of films. I'll show you some examples of it. The most remarkable example really is this first footage of women in public. They are completely covered with their hijab, which is called chador and chakchur. And they are coming into a train station, one shot, and in the other shot they're entering the train, the train itself. So here are the women. Nobody seems to be bothered by camera, perhaps because they don't know what's happening. After the train pulls into the stop properly, you'll see that this is a segregated train, segregated by gender. Women have their own wagon. And here are some of the films that sort of show the taste. These are not documentaries anymore. They're sort of performance films, early films that Akosbashi made in the court. Here's the beating up of the kutule, as they call it, the dwarf. These are the comics, the court jesters doing this, what they normally do for the king here on camera. And this is another scene of beating up the Arab, the other of Iranians. A game of cards soon devolves into this. Here's probably the first recreation. The king, Muzaffaruddin Shah himself, is recreating one of his hunting scenes on his veranda. This is interesting because you see the crowd with the Shah coming towards the camera, but it's clear that somehow the cameraman has told the Shah, Your Excellency, this didn't turn out well. Why don't you go back and redo it? So here's a return. So even documentaries were not actually documentaries, right? They had. Now, once cinema became a public institution by 1904, actually it's interesting that the first public cinema in Iran was established in 1900 by the Catholics in Tabriz. But that was part of the missionary proselytization, so no money was charged apparently. But the first commercial public cinema was established by Ibrahim Khan Akkasbashi, a Tehrani, the same guy who had gone to Canada to London to see films. He established a cinema in 1904 in the back of his antique shop, and he showed films. But and this is where the difficulties come in, because the Ayatollah Nouri had heard that he was showing pictures of women unveiled in his cinema, and so he passed a fatwa against his cinema, and the Shah closed it after a month. So within the first month, the first public cinema was closed, and this guy gave up basically film exhibition and went into exile. And this is the kind of tension that was brought to cinema the moment cinema became public. Another source of tension was women, not only on the screen, but also entry of women into the movie house itself became a big problem, and distributors and exhibitors constantly tried to lure women into cinemas by adopting various clever strategies of saying this is a movie, creating movie houses only for women, or devoting certain time periods for screening of films for women, or sectionating the cinema into two sections, one for women, one for men, or creating two doors, one for women, one for men. You know, all kinds of ways to attract women. Why? You might say. Anybody ideas? Why would they want to bring women? Were they so progressive, or was it some other reason? Money. That's right, because when women came, they didn't come alone. They came with their guardians, with their husbands, with their children. So when a woman came, she brought 3 or 4 other people. Suddenly the income went up. So that, and I have a lot of examples of these kinds of techniques they use through using advertisements from newspapers and other things. Another interesting thing about the Iranian cinema that is rarely talked about is the situation with the dandies. Dandyism is a phenomenon that has to do with the contact between East and West, and it's a phenomenon that Iranian intellectuals have condemned invariably, because I think they have misunderstood what the dandies were doing, actually. And a lot of filmmakers themselves were dandies, as you can see, these guys all. And these in Persian were called fokoli. Fokoli, that comes from fokol, French term for the collar, for the stiff collar that he's wearing. But it applied to the whole get-up and to the whole westernized sense and fashion. And these were really figures who were not only critical of Iranian tradition, but also of the West. And I think they were very important figures. And they became important in cinema, in radio, in cartoons. They were made fun of everywhere and theorized about everywhere. It's a very fascinating history. Here's another one, another exhibitor, Ardashes Batmagarian, who's wearing his medals. He was Armenian, for example, and he narrated films in his own Armenian Persian accent, which was quite cute, according to people who heard it. The first silent feature film that we have was made by an Armenian, Avanes Ohanians. And it's interesting that it squarely treats the subject of it is cinema and the contact and the contrast between tradition and modernity. You've seen a lot of films by Kiarostami and Mahmal Baf and others in recent years, and everybody is wondering, why are these films so self-reflexive? They're all about cinema, they're all about the topics, they're ostensible topics, but they're also about cinema in one way or another. I think the Iranian self-reflexivity is really structural, and in this first film, a silent film, the subject of it is cinema. A director played by Ohanian himself is looking for a new topic for his film, and he discovers this Haji, this religious person who's gone to Mecca, and that's why he's called Haji, who has a wife, who has a daughter who's modern, and she wants to become an actress. And she has a fiancé who also wants to become an actress, and the two of them want to go to acting school. And of course, he loathes cinema because it's foreign, it's immoral, blah blah blah. Until they concoct a story to record him on film. They steal his watch, and he goes around the city to look for his watch, which allows the filmmaker to show sights of modernity and so forth. And then at the end, they lure him into the cinema and they say, "Come on, look at this film." And when he sees himself on the screen, suddenly he's transformed 180 degrees. And he says to his daughter, that, "No problem. I wish you to have 12 children, and all of them become actors." So suddenly, cinema becomes is allowed. So let me just show you a bit of the beginning of it. It's a comedy in 8 reels. It says the film is in intertitled in 3 languages, again, which shows the kind of cosmopolitanism of the filmmaker. The filmmaker was born in Russia. He barely could speak Persian when he made this film. And for the first time, he uses the term for director, régisseur from French, and mu'allaf. This is very interesting. He calls himself mu'allaf, auteur, which is a term that many years later began to be used again. It says the photographer is Rembrandt. I don't know whether the name of the guy was actually Rembrandt or he's referring to Rembrandt the painter. He had to actually establish his own film acting school in order to teach people how to act for his film. He was a very enterprising guy. And again, this is still the workshop time period, where he, like the master craftsman, has to do everything himself. Meydan Toubkhane Tehran, a site of modernity, big buildings, lots of cars. You can see the beginning of the Pahlavi uniform coming into the street. This is before this film came out, before the actual regulation that forced women to remove their hijab and men to put Western clothes on. But the film is already ahead of the general population, ahead of the government in a way. Here's the fiancé. He's wearing the Pahlavi outfit, which was this French hat plus a jacket and pants. And this is the director looking for a new topic underneath all the scripts he's written. That's Ohanian himself. As you can see, he's also a westernized guy, suit, tie. Where's my heart? Here? No? There? No? No. In those days of what directors did, how they wrote their script. Now he's got a dandy assistant. He proceeds to emasculate immediately with his scissors. Okay, let's go ahead to the ending of the film. Here, the Haji is sitting in the cinema watching, and what we're seeing is the Haji watching films, so the film keeps cutting from him to the films, scenes of the film, and back to him, and so forth. So you have both Haji watching and the films that he's been in. A mixed audience. And this kid says, "Oh, look, this is Haji himself." And of course, once he realizes that's him, then he gets all puffed up and he becomes a kind of a celebrity. And in a way, look at how he walks with such confidence. And this film also shows the power of self-representation for people who were feeling so inferior because of that trauma of encounter with the West. I think that's why filmmaking was such a powerful thing for Iranians. And there are many places where I document how Iranians abroad criticized some films that showed Iran as a backward country and so forth. Yeah, this just continues. All right. Now, the first domestic sound of film. This is actually not domestic. The first Persian language film was made in India, again showing that Iranian cinema was transnational from the beginning. Both in the silent era we had that, and in the sound era. And this was by an Iranian expat poet who was interested in the Upanishad and the Zoroastrian Parsi books, and he had gone to India to study that, and he came into contact with Ardeshir Irani, who was the CEO of Imperial Film, and so Sepanta, this Iranian guy, wrote the script and acted in the film. This is him acting in the film, and the film was and they imported actors and actresses from Iran, and they shot the film in Persian language, and they exported the film to Iran and became very successful, and it resulted in 4 more features in Persian by Sepanta, all of them made in India. So now, what happened in the silent era movie houses? The movies may have been silent, but there was anything but silence in the cinema itself, because there was a lot of stuff going on. This is an example. It's a painting by Jafar Tejaratchi of what he remembers from stories that he had heard from his parents and so forth about what film spectatorship in 1920 was like. Here's an open air cinema. People are sitting on top of the roofs on one side, on the top, on the right, and on the left, and watching the film. The musicians are behind the screen playing live music. 3 scenes of fighting going on the screen. Charlie Chaplin, 2 people in the audience, and a poster against the back wall there. The audience is sectionated. The women are toward us, and the men towards the back of the cinema. One woman has a goat here in the front. Another one is cooking abgusht or a stew. And a third one is holding her baby peeing. And the woman behind her tells her in that cartoon bubble that Abji or sister, after you finish with the baby, can you stir the pot? The thing is that food was not the only source of smell, since at times filmgoers or their impatient children who did not want to miss the movie urinated on the floor instead of leaving the hall for the restroom. And also the guy in the center with the stick in his hand, he's the Dilmaj, the translator guy, the curtain reciter guy, who is now functioning not only as curtain reciter to explain the movie to the audience who are not used to reading a film. He's also become the disciplinarian to discipline the audience to change their habit from being active, engaged, oral, engage audiences of oral texts. Because in oral text, people are part of the text, part of the show. They encourage, they by the voices, the sounds they make, the cries, the laughs, or whatever, they encourage the performer. In cinema, they can't do that. They're supposed to be silent, quiet, and so forth. So they have to be disciplined, actually. And in this case, this guy is partly performing that to make them behave. Shusha Guppy relates a possibly apocryphal story that illustrates the kind of haggling that was going on in the cinema in those days, in particular about smell and other things. She says, in desperation, the management projected a plea on the screen before each showing. It's a little bit rough language, so I apologize, but I'm quoting directly. This is what the projected plea says. Gentlemen are requested to kindly refrain from relieving themselves inside the cinema, or simply says, please do not urinate here, but use lavatories outside. When polite language failed to produce the expected result, harsher words were used. God's curse on the son of a whore who pisses in the cinema, or whoever pisses in this place is the son and brother and husband of whores. He himself is a bugger. No good. Finally, it was thought that the image would succeed where words had proved ineffectual. A drawing of a huge equine penis was projected with this caption: "This will bugger any son of a whore who dares to piss here, and will then take care of his wife, mother, and sister as well." The audience just laughed and turned the insult back onto the management by drawing similar niceties on the walls of the cinema. Eventually, a solution was found. A little ditch was dug all around the auditorium, which carried away any liquid from the floor to the sewer. It would take years for movie exhibitors to train pre-modern audiences used to the collective, unruly, and noisy mode of oral tradition entertainment to learn the new modern habits of silent, respectful, individualized film viewing. So that takes care of volume 1. Volume 2. I'm not going to do all the 4 volumes, don't worry. I'll do only volume 2 and leave the rest for some other time. Basically, under the Pahlavi, the second Pahlavi, cinema became industrialized. Studios were formed, dubbing studios were formed, production studios were formed, television came into being, recording studios came, radio also. All of these institutions of pop culture and media came, and they all reinforced one another and cross-fertilized one another. And that's one of the things that I demonstrate in the book. For example, that's how the star system develops, through the kind of circulation of star persona through various media. Production increased to satisfy mass audiences, to satisfy individual tastes, and the state also became part of became very involved, not only by creating rules and regulations for importing and exporting, but also for censorship, also for cinema conditions, for prices, all of those kinds of things. Right after the war, one of the most interesting developments was which I examine in a long chapter, is the fascinating, how shall I say, a fascinating conflict between the Allied powers, Britain, UK, US, and Soviet Union, who were allies in the war, still fighting in the war. In terms of their cultural politics, they began to work against each other to win the hearts and minds of the Iranians towards their own society. Naila Karim Cook, who was a kind of a hippie, one early hippie, and who became an aficionado of Gandhi, and went to his ashram and stayed with him for several years, and apparently had some sort of sexual liaison with him. It became a kind of a strange situation. Anyway, she came to Iran, and she was the second person in command of the U.S. consul, and she was appointed as the Iran censorship czar. She worked at what became the Ministry of Culture, and was in charge of granting license for any film and any theater that was to be performed in Iran. And I went through all of her papers and in the confidential files of the State Department. They were quite extensive and quite, instructive as to the power games between the Americans and the British and the Soviets over film. The Soviets had a number of cinemas in Tehran and some other northern part of the cities, and the Communist Party was very strong during these years. And the Soviets also had a cultural society where language was taught, but also Russian films, Soviet films were being shown. The British had a similar kind of, the British Council had similar kind of establishments in Iran, but also had mobile film units that went through parts of Iran to show films. The Americans had the most extensive of these. The USIS, or USIA, United States Information Agency, established perhaps the first documentary studio and film lab in Iran, and hired a team headed by a Syracuse University professor, which is then called Syracuse team, to go to Iran and to teach filmmaking to Iranians. And so this group made 802 films in Persian in the early 1950s. At the same time that the Americans and the British MI6 were involved in the Topoli Mossadegh and bringing the Shah back. They were staging a coup on one hand, and they were organizing these extensive developmental programs in Iran, buttressed by films. And some of these filmmakers who were trained in the USIS operation came to the US and became famous directors. Reza Badi'i, you may not recognize him, but actually he is a very famous filmmaker. He has directed more television episodes than anybody else in this country, and was so recognized, and recently died in the U.S. And he was trained in the USIA operation. USIA also had a 40 mobile film unit traveling across the country, and that included basically a projectionist who was also the driver, and a 16 millimeter Bell & Howell projector, a screen, and loudspeakers. And with that, he traveled all over the place to schools and to barracks and to villages and so forth, showing films. In some cases...
Just kind of summarize in 5 minutes or so, just leave a little bit of time for questions.
Yes.
We just have till 1:30.
Oh, we do? Okay, all right. Well, this was a very important, operation. Students came. This is my own film review written at age 9 of one of these USIS films. This is about Peyvan Zadan, which means grafting. The film was about grafting. Most of the USIS films were public health or agricultural developmental thing. During this period, a very active movement of documentary films was in Iran, emerged. Forough Farrokhzad made this film about the lepers in Iran, dealing with them very humanly, using a kind of poetic, realist narration. Kamran Shirdel, on the other hand, used the contrapuntal style of filmmaking to punch hole in the official stories of progress in Iran. He made a number of very critical films. None of them were allowed to be screened in Iran. Two fiction film genres developed in Iran. One called film Farsi, which is the popular cinema, which is marked in this cartoon. The director is on the right with his lure, which is a woman, a sexy woman, before a male audience. Sex was a major selling point in the film Farsi or popular cinema. Men did violent things and muscular things, and women showed off their bodies. Salome is another one. This is a famous, another genre of film Farsi called tough guy films. And tough guys, as you can see, that guy over there in the back is dressed in a particularly coded outfits, and so were the women. All of these films had a scene of cabaret in which women danced for the men, and a camera using a kind of a male gaze filmed the proceedings. This is the most famous tough guy film. And this is, I'm going to show you a little bit of this cabaret dance for those of you who haven't seen, just to see the aesthetics of the dance itself, but also of the filming.
چطوری خوشگل؟
تو خوشگلی یا من؟
تو خوشگلی. ما پامون از 30 سال بذاریم اونور میشیم یه آکله.
من از اهواز میام. اینجا نشونی یه زن رو بهم دادن.
He's looking for someone, for a woman. He's got some money for her. And it happens to be the dancer. So he has to wait until she finishes the dance. Which you get the idea. I think I'll just finish by finishing off the tough guys and then leave the other genre of new wave critical films for some other time. The genres that are deeply rooted in a society don't die. They just evolve. And so the luti or the tough guy genre was very popular in Iran. But when the revolution came, the tough guys were thrown in the trash, basically, and considered to be immoral and thugs and so forth. But the character of the tough didn't die. An Islamic tough guy evolved, especially with the war developing and so forth. These tough guys now, instead of being urban toughs, they became toughs in the war against the Iraqis and so forth. So they transformed themselves that way. Many of the actors of the tough guy movies immigrated to the US, to Los Angeles, like Bahman Mofid, for example. And they in LA began to develop their own TV series about the toughs, now displaced. So here's the guy with his machete in running around Beverly Hills Street after his rivals. Very kind of dichotomous image. Going to restaurants, ordering 16 different chelo kebab, eating it all. That's one of the things that they are known legendarily, is their huge appetite. The tough guy, little doll. The music videos began to adopt the tough guys, except that instead of the men dancing, the women began to dance the tough guys dance. The kind of cross-gender, cross-dressing and cross-gender performance, which is quite interesting and cute. And this is the latest example of it. The Beshkan Dance Academy in Irvine performed that. These are all young kids who've never seen a real luti in their lives, perhaps, except in the movies. And there you have it. I think I'll stop. The section that I would have talked about focuses on the kinds of social critical films that came about during that time, made by intellectual filmmakers who were opposed to the government. And in many ways, they seem to have predicted in their films what was going to happen 10 years hence. So with that, thank you very much. I'm sorry it took long.
One of the very interesting things about, so the book is about, it's a social history of Iranian cinema. And you've written quite a bit about accented cinema in the past. And so some of the genre you discuss, the exile cinema, clearly it's logically, accented. It's by definition perhaps accented. But how do you deal with, if you begin with a dramatic encounter with the West? I would assume that in films in the artisanal era and the industrializing era, there are various kinds of accents that show up out of perhaps this encounter, out of the sheer radical diversity of Iranian society. How do you account for these theoretically? In other words, when does a tiny difference become an accent?
Yeah, I think the tiny difference becomes an accent when it crosses over the works of one person. It goes beyond one film that person makes, and also crosses over to other filmmakers when the accent is picked up by more than one person. Then I think you can say that something general is going on. For example, in the Iranian diaspora films, I see a kind of retrospective look to the world. It's not so much looking ahead, but always looking back somehow, trying to figure out what happened or where they were or where home was, and kind of nostalgic longing and so forth. And there are differences amongst them, but regardless of their differences, invariably this kind of retrospection seems to be endemic to at least the first group of Iranian exiles. The second generation, third generation have different concerns, but the first generation is really sort of focused on that. So that's why you could say this is an accent, and it's not just a peculiarity of one director or that. Yes?
Yeah, Hamid, I wonder if you see in this early cinema anything similar to the kind of exchanges that you see in Western cinema between the other arts and the cinema, either a kind of parasitic relationship or just an influential one. And I noticed that at least some of the clips you showed or mentioned, poets seem to be involved in cinema as well. And I wonder if that's something that's fairly distinctive and making a great leap forward. I wonder if you see that sort of poetic exchange continuing in contemporary Iranian cinema.
Yeah, I think that's a good question too. The poetry being such an important art form for Iranians, it would be natural to think that had a place. But I think the place that it really showed itself was in documentaries, actually, with the Furugh Farrokhzad documentary about the lepers, which sort of delivered by herself as a poet, that really, I think, inaugurated this kind of that was very sensitive. The problem is that the other directors, the subsequent to her, developed this poetic voiceover into a kind of authoritarian, flowery language that you couldn't get at first hearing. You had to listen to it several times, and anyway, it was very verbose. But in her hand, I think poetry really and cinema wedded together beautifully. And in today's cinema also, you can see some of that in the works of Rakhshan Bani Etemad. In particular, her film *The May Lady*, which is whose main character is a filmmaker named Forugh, and she also reads and says poetry in a very delicate, non-authoritarian way. And then later on in the new wave cinema, a lot of poets and writers worked together with the directors to develop a very symbolic, metaphoric language of protest, which also was very strong. But next time. Yeah. Yes. Well?
So it was really fascinating to hear that when cinema first comes to Iran, it's being developed mostly in the court. But then when you showed those two examples of court filmmaking, it seemed to look so much like slapstick, right? And so this genre in the U.S. and in other places that's associated with a working class attitude and a certain type of rough and tumble spirit I see similarities in what you're showing there. So is that indicative of the type of film that was made for the court, and how do you explain these similarities?
Yeah, I think there was a kind of a theater in Iran that was called Ruhozi Theater, which is a kind of a lower class theater that had slapstick in it, which was played both in the courts and in popular theaters. And it also involved oftentimes a blackface character who was the nemesis of the boss, whoever the boss was. And he constantly undermined the boss in one way or another, either by deliberately misunderstanding the boss or doing something funny, slapsticky to the boss. And what we see here are basically slapstick things that are performed by the court jesters, the kinds of stuff that they would have done normally live. And in answer to your question, Tim, also another thing other than poetry in terms of other arts is the kind of traditional theatrical things, in addition to the curtain reciting that I was mentioning. There are quite a number of those kinds of things that Iranians intuitively brought into early films and later on were developed in other cinemas.
So if Michael Delagarpini were here, I know he'd ask the methodology question, so I'll ask it. I was interested that it's a social history of Iranian cinema. I just makes me think of Bob Sklar's great History of American Cinema, which in 1975 comes out as a social history of American cinema, just suggests, I guess, a kind of a now school connection. And then 1 year later, it's re-released in the second edition, and it's called The Cultural History. So it kind of suggests that it's kind of early stages of cultural studies, Richard Hoggard. So I was wondering how you think about this connection between society and film culture, politics.
Yeah, I mean, that's one reason that it took so long, because it's partly because, at least in the case of Iran, the sources for the social history or any aspect of cinema were so widespread, and some of it had not been done. For example, I had to read a lot of, say, journals, travel journals, in order to get one morsel. I spent, appropriate to our situation here, I spent 2 weeks here at the Presbyterian Historical Archives here in Philadelphia, going through their early, diaries of the missionaries, the the minutes of meetings that they had in Iran. They were very active in Iran. And I was interested in knowing what kind of audiovisual technology they were using for their proselytization before cinema. And I spent 2 weeks, and I came back with one paragraph in which this lady described how she showed stereoopticon slides to Iranian and how they were fascinated by the life of Jesus that she showed and so forth. So when you're one of the first people who is doing social history, you sort of have to create your own data. I don't mean out of the blue, but you have to dig them up and give. And many Iranian historians have done a lot of this too. But these were all in Persian, and these were secondhand. So if you wanted to get the actual document yourself, you had to. I spent some time at the Iranian archives as well as the British Council archives and the U.S. State Department archives. So some of it. Some of the shape of the work has to do with what I found. But I found in the case of Iran that politics was important as well as culture, because politics, especially authoritarian governments, ruled so much over society. And they were, in some cases, themselves agents of these new things. For example, the court also brought in the gramophones. They introduced a lot of the new westernized things. So one had to include, and some of them were themselves modernists, and some of them were not. So I felt that I had to deal with the politics. But again, this is not a This is not. I stayed with the politics as long as it had a bearing on culture. But didn't discuss politics per se. And then class was very important as well. Class and connections between the kinship and also class connection amongst the rich, the kind of oligarchy that existed. That was also important. So I'm not sure. Alas, Bob is gone. Yeah.
Okay, great. No, thank you.
Thanks.